while the mourners were still gathered downstairs, drinking quietly to Thomas Higgins's memory in the front room of the house where he had just died. A doctor was upstairs opening his body to find out why a man of 45 in good health only days before had gone so suddenly and so violently into the ground. That is not a metaphor for how quickly suspicion moved in this case. It is a literal description of what happened. The wake was still underway, the neighbours and family still filing through to pay their respects, the ordinary rituals of Liverpool working-class grief still playing out exactly as they always did, when a post-mortem examination was carried out on the body at the very centre of that gathering, close enough that the smell of the wake's own refreshments must have mixed with whatever the surgeon's instruments disturbed in the room above. What that examination found would end 2 women's lives on the gallows and expose one of the most calculating insurance frauds of the entire Victorian era, a fraud that had already, by the time anyone thought to look closely, claimed at least 4 lives across 3 years. Tonight we revisit one case where the swindle and the killing were never 2 separate things at all, where the fraud could not exist without the murder, and the murder existed for no reason but the fraud, a distinction this channel does not often get to draw quite so starkly. One rooming house in Liverpool, 2 sisters, an untold number of burial society policies taken out on the very people sharing their table, and a body count that included, when the truth finally surfaced, one of their own children. The case of Flanagan and Margaret Higgins begins in the working-class streets of Liverpool, in the tightly packed lodging houses that gave shelter for a weekly rent to the dock labourers and hod carriers who kept one of the busiest ports in the world running. Liverpool, in the final decades of the 19th century, was one of the great engine rooms of the British Empire, its docks handling a vast share of the nation's trade with the wider world, cotton and sugar and timber flowing through warehouses that stretched for miles along the Mersey. That trade needed hands, endless hands, to load and unload it, and the city drew labourers from across the British Isles and well beyond, none more numerous than the Irish, who had been arriving in overwhelming numbers since the famine decades before, filling the cramped courts and terraced streets that ringed the docks with a population living, for the most part, one bad week away from genuine crisis. It was a city of extraordinary wealth passing constantly through its warehouses, and extraordinary poverty housed only streets away. A city where a hod carrier like Thomas Higgins might work a full and exhausting week and still find himself, at the end of it, with barely enough to cover rent and food, let alone any cushion against illness or misfortune. Flanagan, born around 1829, and her younger sister Margaret, born around 1843, were Irish women who had made their way, as so many had, to Liverpool, a city whose docks pulled in a constant tide of migrant labour from across Ireland and beyond. By 1880, Catherine was running a rooming house at 5 Skirving Street, taking in lodgers in the ordinary way of the era's working-class landladies, letting rooms to whichever families could pay the weekly rent and keeping her own household, including her son, John Flanagan, under the same crowded roof. Among her lodgers by that year were a hod carrier named Thomas Higgins, his young daughter Mary, and a man named Patrick Jennings with his own daughter, also named Margaret, all of them paying their weekly rent into the same household economy that Catherine and her sister quietly ran. It was, on the surface, nothing more than one more overcrowded Liverpool lodging house, the kind that existed by the hundred in the streets around the docks, families and strangers, pressed together under one roof because none of them could afford anything better. To understand what Catherine Flanagan and Margaret Higgins were actually exploiting, you first have to understand what a burial society meant to a family like the ones sharing their table. In an age before any general system of state welfare, the terror of a pauper's funeral, a body buried without ceremony, without a coffin the family could be proud of, without the dignity a working family desperately wanted to give its dead, was one of the deepest and most universal fears of the Victorian poor. Burial societies existed to answer that fear. For a modest weekly premium, a family could insure a life, however humble, against the shame of dying without a proper send-off, and upon a death the society would pay out a sum sufficient to cover a respectable funeral, and often a little more besides. It was one of the few forms of genuine financial protection available to the very poorest households in Britain, and it depended entirely on the good faith of the people paying into it. Catherine Flanagan and Margaret Higgins looked at that system and saw something no honest policyholder was ever meant to see. They saw that a burial society did not simply insure against death. It could, in the wrong hands, be turned into an instrument for producing it, and that the poorer and more anonymous the insured life, the less likely anyone was to look closely at how or why that life had ended. There was, in the structure of these societies, a specific vulnerability the sisters exploited with real precision. Burial societies operated with almost none of the underwriting scrutiny that a modern insurer would apply. There was, in practice, nothing stopping a single household from insuring the same life across several different societies simultaneously, each one unaware of the others, each one collecting the same weekly premium and prepared to pay out the same lump sum on the same death without ever comparing notes with a rival society across town. A single life, insured 5 times over, as Thomas Higgins's ultimately was, could be made to yield a payout worth several times what any single honestly priced policy would ever have provided, and no clerk behind any counter in Liverpool was checking whether the same name appeared on a rival society's books. The sisters had, in effect, discovered a gap between several genuinely well-intentioned charitable institutions, a gap invisible to each society individually and catastrophic only when a single household chose to exploit all of them at once. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now, back to the record. The method the sisters settled on was chillingly simple and drew on a poison that sat, quite literally, in plain sight in every Victorian household. Ordinary flypaper of the period was manufactured using arsenic, soaked into the paper to attract and kill the flies that swarmed every kitchen in a city without modern sanitation. Nobody thought twice about a household keeping flypaper about. What Catherine Flanagan and Margaret Higgins discovered, or learned from whoever first showed them, was that soaking that same ordinary flypaper in water produced a solution containing arsenic in a concentration entirely sufficient to kill a grown adult, administered patiently, in small doses, over the course of several days, disguised in food or drink and easily mistaken by any doctor not specifically looking for it, for one of the era's common gastric illnesses. In December of 1880, Catherine's own son, John Flanagan, died at the age of 22. His mother collected £71 from his burial society. Sit with that fact for a moment before we go any further, because I do not think it can be absorbed quickly. This was not a scheme that targeted only strangers, only lodgers, whose lives held some cold transactional value and no more. Catherine Flanagan's first documented victim, by every indication the very beginning of this entire scheme, was her own child. Whatever grief a mother is supposed to carry for a son who dies at 22, Catherine Flanagan converted into a payment of £71, and having done it once, without consequence, without a single question asked by the society that paid her, she had learned the method worked. If this account has taken hold of you the way it has taken hold of me, I would ask you to sit with it a while longer rather than moving past it too quickly, because everything that follows in this case flows directly from that first unthinkable transaction. The pattern continued with a terrible, businesslike regularity. Margaret Higgins married Thomas Higgins, the hod-carrier lodging in her sister's house, on the 28th of October 1882, becoming in the process stepmother to his young daughter Mary. Mary Higgins was 8 years old, age when a child is fully herself, with opinions and small stubbornnesses and a whole personality already formed, an age at which a mother, even a new stepmother married only months earlier, should have had every reason to know her, to have learned what made her laugh or what she was afraid of in the dark. Instead, within months of that marriage, Mary Higgins was dead, and the woman who had just become her stepmother collected the payout from the child's own burial society policy, a policy that had been arranged in the ordinary course of the household's insurance before there had been any time at all for a genuine bond between them to take root, or perhaps precisely so that none would need to. In January of 1883, Margaret Jennings, the 19-year-old daughter of another lodger, died, and Catherine collected that payout in turn. And in October of 1883, Thomas Higgins himself, Margaret's own husband, died at the age of 45, a man who had, by this point, been insured across 5 separate burial societies simultaneously, a detail that on its own should have raised every alarm the system possessed, leaving his widow to collect a combined sum in the region of £100, 4 deaths, a son, a stepdaughter, a lodger's daughter, a husband, each one insured, each one profitable, each one initially recorded and accepted as the ordinary, unremarkable misfortune of a poor Liverpool household in an era when poor households buried their own with grim and constant regularity. That regularity was the sisters' entire cover. Death among the Liverpool working poor was common enough, and medical scrutiny of it thin enough, that 4 deaths across 3 years inside the same small circle of lodgers and family did not on its own strike anyone as a pattern rather than simple bad luck. Consider Margaret Jennings for a moment, because she is the easiest of the 4 to lose entirely inside a list of names and dates. She was 19 years old, the daughter of a fellow lodger, a young woman almost certainly working in whatever trade was available to a girl of her class and age in a dockside city, perhaps in domestic service, perhaps in one of the small workshops or laundries that employed so many young Liverpool women of the period. She had a father, Patrick Jennings, living under the same roof, who buried her in January of 1883, believing, as every family in that house was encouraged to believe, that death had simply come for his daughter the way it came, without warning or reason, for so many young people in that century. He had no way of knowing that the woman collecting the burial society's sympathy alongside its payment had measured out the means of his daughter's death herself. What finally broke that cover was not the authorities, and it was not any medical suspicion arising from within the household itself. It was Thomas Higgins's own brother, Patrick, who could not accept the speed and violence of a healthy man's collapse. Thomas had seemed, by every account, in ordinary health only days before his death, and the swiftness of his decline, attributed at the time to dysentery, struck Patrick as wrong in a way he could not simply let pass. When he began asking questions, he discovered the full extent of his brother's insurance. 5 separate burial society policies on one working man's life, a level of coverage wildly disproportionate to anything an ordinary hod carrier's household would normally arrange. He took his suspicions to the authorities. Picture what it actually took for Patrick Higgins to act on that suspicion, because a Victorian working man questioning a doctor's diagnosis in an era when medical authority was rarely challenged by anyone outside the profession itself, was not a small or a comfortable thing to do. Dysentery was a common and unremarkable killer in the crowded, poorly sanitized streets around the Liverpool docks, and any doctor recording it as a cause of death would have expected the matter to end there, filed and forgotten among the ordinary tally of a poor district's mortality. Patrick Higgins had to override his own instinct to accept a professional's word, had to go looking for information a grieving man is rarely in any state to go looking for, and had to be willing to accuse, at least implicitly, the very sister-in-law who had just lost her husband, a woman the wider family had every social reason to comfort rather than suspect. That he did it anyway, in the raw days immediately following his brother's death, is the single hinge on which this entire case turned. That suspicion led directly to the scene this account opened with, post-mortem examination carried out on Thomas Higgins's body while his own wake was still underway in the rooms below. The surgeons found what Patrick Higgins had feared: arsenic present in Thomas's organs in quantities that indicated the poisoning had taken place gradually over the course of several days, precisely the pattern that repeated patient dosing with flypaper solution would produce. A poison expert, Dr. Campbell Brown, examined a bottle containing a mysterious white substance recovered from the household, along with a market pocket, a small purse or bag worn about the person belonging to Margaret Higgins, and confirmed the presence of arsenic in both. Margaret Higgins was arrested almost immediately. Catherine Flanagan fled, evading capture for nearly a week before she was finally taken into custody in Wavertree. And once the authorities began exhuming the earlier dead, John Flanagan, Mary Higgins, and Margaret Jennings, the pattern that 4 separate deaths across 3 years had managed to conceal became all at once impossible to deny. All 3 exhumed bodies showed the same telltale arsenic preservation, the slowing of natural decomposition that experienced investigators had learned to associate directly with poisoning, and traces of the poison itself confirmed in every case. Perhaps the most chilling detail to survive this entire investigation is what Catherine Flanagan offered the authorities once she understood the case against her and her sister was closing in beyond any hope of escape. She claimed, in an apparent bid for leniency, that the 2 of them had been part of something considerably larger, naming 6 or 7 additional suspicious deaths and implicating 5 other women: Margaret Evans, Bridget Begley, Margaret Potter, a Mrs. Fallon, Bridget Stanton, and Catherine Ryan, as fellow conspirators or as insurers who had profited from the same basic scheme. Prosecutors were unable to build a case against any of the additional women she named, and only the 2 sisters were ultimately brought to trial. Whether Catherine's claims pointed to a genuine wider network of insurance murder operating quietly across working-class Liverpool, or whether they were the desperate invention of a woman offering names in exchange for her own life, has never been conclusively settled. Her offer to testify against these alleged conspirators in exchange for a lighter sentence was rejected outright. It is worth sitting with just how plausible her claim actually was, whether or not it was ever proven. The method she and her sister had used required no special equipment, no rare poison obtainable, only through a licensed chemist's careful records, nothing beyond flypaper any household could purchase without a second glance, and a burial society system, with no means of cross-checking its own policyholders. If two sisters in one Liverpool lodging house could discover and exploit that gap independently, there is no obvious reason the same discovery could not have occurred to other women in other lodging houses facing the same grinding poverty and the same glaring absence of oversight. The prosecution's inability to prove Catherine's wider claims is not in itself proof that no wider network existed. May simply be proof of how difficult such a network would have been to detect at all, in a city and a century that had already shown itself remarkably slow to notice 4 deaths inside a single household. Catherine Flanagan and Margaret Higgins were tried together at St. George's Hall in the heart of Liverpool, the proceedings opening on the 14th of February, 1884. The prosecution laid out the case across all 4 deaths, and on the evening of the 16th of February the jury returned guilty verdicts against both sisters. They were sentenced to death, and on the 3rd of March, 1884, they were hanged together at Kirkdale Prison before a crowd estimated at close to 1,000 witnesses gathered outside the gates, attended in their final moments by a Roman Catholic priest. What does this case reveal about the world that made it possible? It reveals how completely an institution built entirely on trust could be weaponized by 2 people willing to abuse that trust without limit. Burial societies functioned because working-class families genuinely paid into them in good faith week after week, on the shared understanding that everyone in the scheme was insuring against death rather than manufacturing it. Catherine Flanagan and Margaret Higgins did not need to defeat any sophisticated system of checks or medical oversight because almost none existed. A working family's death in the Liverpool of the 1880s simply not scrutinized closely enough by doctors stretched thin across an entire poor district, or by burial societies eager to maintain their reputation for prompt and sympathetic payouts. For a pattern of 4 deaths inside one small household to register as anything other than grim coincidence until a single grieving brother refused to accept the easy explanation he was being offered. There is a colder observation sitting beneath that one about exactly how the sisters chose their victims. Every person who died was already among the most vulnerable and least socially visible members of an already poor community: a young adult son, a stepdaughter still a child, a lodger's teenage daughter, a laboring husband. None of them held the kind of social position that might have prompted an unusually rigorous inquiry into an unexpected death. The entire scheme depended on choosing victims from precisely the population Victorian Liverpool was least equipped and least inclined to investigate closely, and it worked for the better part of 3 years, because that calculation proved entirely correct. Compare, for a moment, how differently this case might have unfolded had Thomas Higgins been a man of means rather than a hod-carrier, had his family possessed a private physician on retainer rather than whatever overworked parish doctor happened to be available. Had his sudden death been the kind that drew immediate scrutiny from a coroner accustomed to questioning the deaths of the prominent. The entire mechanism of Victorian medical suspicion ran, disproportionately, along lines of class, and Catherine Flanagan and Margaret Higgins understood, whether consciously articulated or simply absorbed through a lifetime of watching how the world actually worked, that a poor family's grief would be taken at face value in circumstances where a wealthier family's grief would have been immediately and rigorously examined. And there is the darkest thread of all, the one this case forces you to sit with longer than almost any swindle this channel has covered. Catherine Flanagan's decision to begin with her own son suggests something beyond simple opportunism. suggests a woman who had already, by the time she poisoned John Flanagan, crossed whatever internal boundary most people rely on to separate family from profit, love from arithmetic. Once that boundary was crossed for a son, crossing it again for a stepdaughter, a lodger's child, a husband, required perhaps no further threshold at all. The first murder is very often the hardest one a person will ever commit. Catherine Flanagan chose to make hers the one closest to her own blood. There is a particular kind of horror in recognizing that this choice may not have been reckless at all, but calculated with real precision. A son's death draws less official suspicion than a stranger's, in a world where families were assumed to grieve rather than to profit, and a mother collecting a modest burial society payment for her own dead child was, in the Liverpool of 1880, among the least suspicious transactions imaginable. Catherine Flanagan may have selected her own son as the first victim precisely because his death was the safest possible test of the method, the one death least likely to be questioned by anyone at all. If that reading is correct, then the cruelty of this case runs deeper even than the poison itself. It suggests a woman capable of using her own child's body as a trial run, a proof of concept for a system of murder she intended, from the very beginning, to repeat. Here is the question I want to leave you with, and I would like to read your thoughts on it in the comments below. Catherine Flanagan named 5 other women as fellow conspirators in a scheme she claimed was far larger than the 4 deaths that were ever actually proven. If she was telling the truth, an unknown number of working-class Liverpool families may have lost sons, daughters, and husbands to the same quiet arithmetic of premiums and poison, in cases that were never exhumed, never connected, and never brought before any court at all. Do you believe Catherine Flanagan's claim of a wider network, offered as it was by a desperate woman facing the gallows, or do you believe 2 sisters acted entirely alone, and that the horror of this case begins and ends with the 4 names the record can actually confirm? Skirving Street and the other addresses the sisters moved through as suspicion slowly caught up with them. Latimer Street and Ascot Street among them have long since been swallowed by the redevelopment of Liverpool's inner districts, streets and terraces reshaped and rebuilt across more than a century of change. The record remains in the trial proceedings at St. George's Hall, in Dr. Campbell Brown's Phrenic findings, and in the burial society ledgers that once recorded, without a flicker of suspicion, a mother collecting £71 for the death of her own son entered into the books alongside 100 other ordinary claims from 100 other genuinely grieving Liverpool families that same year. Their names were John Flanagan, 22, Mary Higgins, 8, Margaret Jennings, 19, and Thomas Higgins, 45, 4 people bound together by nothing more than the misfortune of sharing a roof, a table, and eventually a poisoner's arithmetic, with 2 sisters who had learned, with terrible precision, exactly how little the world would ask about the death of someone poor. Catherine Flanagan and Margaret Higgins were hanged together, sisters in life and in the manner of their execution both, and the burial societies they had exploited for years continued afterward much as they always had, a system built on trust that had been proven for 3 years running, entirely capable of paying a murderer for her own crimes without ever once thinking to ask her a single question. A child of 8, a young woman of 19, a labouring husband, and a son barely into adulthood went into the ground believing, as their families believed, that they had simply been unlucky. One more small tragedy among the thousands a poor Victorian city absorbed every year without comment. It took a brother's stubborn refusal to accept that story, the surgeon's blade raised while the mourners were still in the house, to give any of them, at last, a truer account of what had actually been done to them. An account none of the other families in that circle of lodgers and kin would ever have received at all had Patrick Higgins simply let his grief close quietly over the question he chose instead to keep asking.